So hello to everybody again, and to those of you who are joining us for the first time, hello and welcome. Welcome to the launch of the spring issue of JR. So I'm going to kick off by talking you through the latest issue before handing you over to our panel of experts to discuss the topic tonight, which is on the life and work of the artists Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. But first, just to tell you a little bit about our spring issue, which you can see here. And we're focusing on Ireland in this issue. This month marks 100 years since the island of Ireland was partitioned to create Northern Ireland in the north, and later leading to the Irish Free State in the south, now the Republic of Ireland. There's been a lot of media coverage of this centenary recently, alongside the continuing discussions about how Brexit has affected Ireland. Sadly, most recently, this has manifested itself in the form of rioting in Belfast. But did you know that Ireland has a long and rich Jewish history? In our current issue, we're taking a look at that history. We start in Belfast in the north, which was home to, among others, the Israeli politician Abba Eban and a former president of Israel, Chaim Herzog. And we take in Londonderry, Limerick, and Dublin. We follow the story of the Kindertransport children who were sent to Mill Isle in County Down, about 20 miles from Belfast, where they helped set up a working farm based on the model of a kibbutz. In the south, around 100 Jewish child refugees from the former Czechoslovakia lived in a Victorian estate called Clonin Castle. Both sets of refugees were welcomed by the local communities. So if we can get the slide up, Danielle, for the writers and poets, radically different. Okay, if we can move on to the next one, that's it, yes. So Ireland is known for its novelists, poets, and artists, and the Jewish community was no exception. The writer Katrina Goldstone examines the work of a group of writers and artists working in the 1920s and 30s who were driven by their beliefs in causes such as Irish nationalism, feminism, and anti-fascism. One of them, Harry Kurnoff, was a fierce socialist, and you can see one of his woodcuts here. Another, Estella Solomons, whose portrait of Frank Gallagher you can see in the top right of the screen, supported Irish Republican paramilitary women's organizations and hid Republicans on the run in her studio under the guise of painting their portrait. So we can see the next slide. Thank you. We also take an in-depth look at the Jewish history of Cork with musician Ruti Lax, who's written about that history in her musical Green Feather Boa. And then moving on to our next page in our art section, our associate editor, Daniel Goldstein, speaks to the wonderful Israeli Persian singer Liraz. Liraz talks to Danielle about how she collaborated with musicians in Iran on her latest album, something that had to be done in secret via telegram and by constantly changing pseudonyms in order not to come to attention of the Iranian authorities. And also in our art section, we hear from our theatre critic, Judy Herman, about a production of The Unicorn and Joe, a new musical based on Wolf Mankiewicz' book, A Kid for Two Farthings. And that's going to be the first production to open a new outdoor space at London's Arcola Theatre in June. We've got a packed book section in this issue. So moving on to books, we have British comedian David Baddiel in discussion with the French rabbi Delphine Horvier about the challenges facing Jews in the UK and France. And then moving into our Sephardi section, we hear from the Iraqi writer Ali Shakir, who's translated a memoir of Jewish Baghdad into Arabic via a publishing house in Beirut. and he himself lives in New Zealand, where he emigrated to. Finally, in our art section, we hear from the art historian Monica Bohm-Duchen about the latest collection of art books, whose common theme is the relationship between art and resistance during World War II. In particular, she focuses on the lives of Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, as uncovered in Jeffrey Jackson's book, Paper Bullets, two artists who risked their lives to defy the Nazis. So at this point, I'll hand you over to Monica, who's going to chair tonight's event. Monica Bohm-Duchen is JR's art critic and a member of the JR editorial committee. She is also the initiator and director of Insiders Outsiders, an ongoing celebration of the contribution of refugees from Nazism to British culture. So Monica, over to you, and let's hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rebecca. Good. Well, it's my pleasure to be chairing this event, which promises to be a rich and thought-provoking one. And we're going to start with a short film made by Jersey Heritage, all of 10 minutes long, brief, but I think useful by way of a kind of setting of the scene for first Aviva's talk and then later Jeffrey Jackson's talk. So without further ado, I will ask Danielle, I think it is, to let us watch the film, and then I will introduce Aviva and later, of course, Jeffrey as well.
New York. The city is hosting the largest Pride celebration in the world, a whole month of events, an annual festival in which thousands take part. And here, 3,000 miles from Jersey, on the other side of the Atlantic, the New York Times runs a story about Claude Cahun, the Jewish-French photographer, sculptor, and writer born in Nantes in 1894, died in Jersey in 1954. Her birth names were Lucy Renée Mathilde Schwab, before she decided that she wanted to be called Claude Cahun. That the New York Times considers her worth such coverage is a measure of how far her fame has spread, along with that of her partner Marcel Moore, really Suzanne Mallareb, later to become her stepsister. Professor David Bowie of the Art Institute of Chicago tells the New York Times, in Cahoon, you've got an artist who turns the camera on themselves to see who else they can become. And Jennifer Shaw, art and history professor at the California College of the Arts, says they were in the mode of investigation, who you could be, how you could be, projecting yourself into another skin, another universe. It's all part of a reappraisal of their surrealist work, a reappraisal that started in the 1990s, 40 years after Lucy Schwab, Claude Cahun, was buried in the churchyard at St. Brelade, a stone's throw from the couple's home.
In her early years, she was very different to a lot of women looked like in Jersey. You know, she was at one point 1916, shaven haired, so you know, really, really different, wore masculine clothes. Somebody that I spoke to who knew her in her later life, I asked him what the islanders thought of Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, and firstly they knew them by their given names, Lucy and Suzanne, but they thought of them as slightly quirky old ladies that were strange because they did things like wear trousers, and that was like, they were strange because they wore trousers and took their cat for a walk on a lead. So it wasn't so much their facial features or what they did with themselves, it's things like wearing trousers and taking your cat for a walk on a lead, which that was seen as slightly quirky. But she was very different, particularly in the early years, and must have very much made an impression. This is a self-portrait from the mid-1920s, and when Claude Cahun was living in Paris and very much part of the Parisian surrealist circle. And here she's dressed as a weightlifter, and has got quite boldly emblazoned on her chest, I am in training, don't kiss me, curiously in English. You know, she's very bilingual, but it's very interesting that she's made that statement in English. very constructed image, full of masquerade and disguise. She's disguised herself as a weightlifter, but has very flat chest, but the nipples very much sort of obvious and delineated. She's got these very pouting lips, very made up lips, and love hearts on her cheeks and kiss curls round her in her hairline. She's got a love heart on her leg. So all of this is very enticing, very attracting, but at the same time, she's got her legs crossed, very, go away, leave me alone kind of thing. It's intriguing because it tries to give us lots of clues about who she was and what she thought and what she was trying to show the rest of the world, but at the same time, it's very dismissive of you being interested in all of that. It's inviting, but pushing away at the same time. This set of two images is from slightly later, in the late 1920s. But again, that's quite interesting. These are quite interesting as well because they show one of the ways in which Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore work together in creating portraits. We call them self-portraits, but of course Claude Cahun couldn't have pressed the button. But this gives you a hint of how they actually did that. Claude Cahun made herself up, was the subject of the photograph, dressed herself up, put her makeup on to create the photograph. Marcel Moore may very well have been a stand-in for her to get lighting right, all of that, poses right, all that kind of thing. So, but you can see they're quite different ways that these women are looking. Claude Cahun is very focused, very unemotional. Marcel Moore looks slightly awkward, as if she doesn't want to be there, and I wonder if that's very much sort of symptomatic of their relationship. Claude Cahun was the outward person, the very creative, but Marcel Moore was the very supportive, almost sort of the power behind Claude Cahun in that way, and enabled a lot of the photographs to be actually created. We've got this little drawing, which is very significant actually, because it's from very early in their lives together, and it really does demonstrate how close they were together in their relationship. It's a little drawing of some lips, an eyeball, and some shoes. But very cleverly, Claude Cahun has intertwined their initials from their birth names, Lucy Schwab and Suzanne Mallareb, has combined them into LSM, which LSM, Els Aimants, they love each other in the initials, then included her name in the lips and Suzanne in the eyeball, and then intertwined in the laces of the shoe is LSM again, reiterating the fact that they are a partnership, really intertwined together.
3 years after Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore settled in Jersey, the island was occupied by German troops. The pair printed anti-German propaganda, which led to them being arrested and jailed in 1944. The sentence? Death.
The things that they did, encouraging troops to rebellion through the little pamphlets that they wrote, were very, very daring. I mean, they lived, both of them, lived a life of resistance. They always rebelled against, kind of enforced rules and regulations. They wanted people to express themselves as individuals throughout their life. So they really did rebel against any kind of repression whatsoever. So the fact that they were actually living on an island with an occupying force was completely against all of their principles of freedom and freedom of expression and the rights of the individual. So yes, they did carry out a very brave two-person resistance campaign, inciting troops to rebellion, really, trying to encourage troops to think about what they were doing in terms of what they were being asked to do by their leaders. And they kept that going for a very long time during the occupation until they were actually caught and put on trial. It took a very long time for their trial to come about because the investigating authorities couldn't believe that these two little old ladies had actually carried out all this resistance activity by themselves. They thought there must be somebody else, and they thought there must be a man involved somewhere. But it wasn't. It was these two ladies that lived in St Brillards carrying out all this resistance, for which they were imprisoned. And when the trial came to its fruition, they were actually sentenced to death. But that sentence was fortunately commuted, which I think Claude Cahun in particular objected. She wanted to be a martyr for her cause. She wanted to be seen to be the freedom fighter. But their death sentence was commuted, and they weren't let out of prison until liberation. This photograph was in Claude Cahun's collection of photographs. So why it was this photograph within the collection, it wasn't one that she'd taken or anything to do with Marcel Moore. It's a Jersey Evening Post photograph. So looking at the crowd scene, looking at why she might have a copy of this photograph, I noticed that what looks very much like Claude Cahun is there underneath the sailor's arm in the middle of the crowd scene. So she was a freedom fighter, and she demonstrated by being part of the crowd about how happy she was that the island had its freedom again.
Cahoon never recovered from the experience of jail, dying 10 years later. Marcel Moore lived until 1972, when she took her own life. And that might have been that, if it hadn't been for an exhibition in London in 1994, after which interest in the work of this unusual couple really took off. Thanks to numerous publications, including Louise Downey's Don't Kiss Me, The Art of Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, published in 2006, this once-forgotten surrealist art and its creators was properly documented, ensuring a new set of fans.
Good. Well, that glossed over many an issue, but I hope it served to whet your interest and curiosity about this remarkable couple. I'm going to hand over in a minute to Aviva Deutsch to talk fairly briefly, but in more depth, about the pre-Jersey period in their lives. So let me just tell you, first of all, a bit about Aviva. As many of you will know, she is now the executive director of Jewish Renaissance magazine, but she also lectures extensively on modern Jewish culture at the University of Roehampton, the London School of Jewish Studies, and JW3, and is a regular contributor to courses and programs for such eminent institutions as the British Library, the British Museum, and BBC Radio 4. She also works as a freelance curator and producer for many leading arts institutions in London, including the Royal Academy and Tate Exchange. And last but not least, I should say she is a practicing poet herself. Her poems, reviews, and literary essays have been widely published in magazines and anthologies. I could go on, Aviva, but I won't, but I'll simply end by saying that your first full collection of poems, am I right, entitled rather tantalizingly We Sigh for Houses, is due to be published next year. Over to you, Aviva.
Thank you, Monica. Do you know my instruction to Monica was you don't need to be fulsome, so if that's her not being fulsome, thank you very much. Normally I would just say I'm here, and I really am here as the director of Jewish Renaissance. But actually, since Monica mentioned it, I did have a career as a curator. I don't do so much of it now. I'm working with Rebecca at the magazine. But my first encounter with Claude Cahun was very much in that role, and it was at the Tate. So her work has been extensively shown in various exhibitions at the Tate, exhibitions of women's art and exhibitions of queer art. And I have to say, what kept entering my mind when I'd see a work of hers pop up here or there was, but she's never contextualized as a Jewish artist. You know, it's very rare to see her in an exhibition of Jewish art. So one of the things I just wanted to do today, before we hand over to Jeffrey, who is the real expert and who's going to tell us in depth all about her life in Jersey, is really talk to you as one of those fans that was mentioned on the film, but talk to you about why I think she belongs in the pages of Jewish Renaissance alongside Marcel Moore. I mean, up till this point, Marcel Moore or Suzanne hasn't been given as much credit, but Jeffrey's work is one of the big kind of projects behind readdressing that. And I think he's going to hopefully bring Marcel or Suzanne much more to the fore for us today. But I just want to start really by looking at why I think Claude Cahun, because she is, I mean, that surname Cahoon really gives it away, doesn't it? She is the one with the Jewish heritage in the partnership. Why I think Jewish Renaissance deserves to be addressing her, and we should really think about her and her drivenness as a progressive radical, someone who is a pivot of the resistance in the Channel Islands, but actually whose family were part of a political resistance in France to fascism. You know, why we should think of her in terms of our history. So I'm going to start. I've got a little PowerPoint for us, and I'm just going to set it up a bit more. I'm going to start with the photo you just saw on the screen, which was also kind of the photo posing and posed by her partner, Marcel Moore. And because one of the things I think is really interesting about Claude Cahun or Lucy Schwab, and I'm going to use Claude Cahun at first as the artist, but I'll use Lucy, her birth name, when I start talking about her family. One of the things this shows is how conscious she was of identity. She is always creating her image. You can see her here staring directly at the camera. You know, she is looking at us as much as we are looking at her. And everything about how she puts herself together is a direct choice, including a choice to take a surname for her pen name, which is explicitly Jewish. Whereas Schwab was a Jewish name that got her into a lot of trouble. She could have easily let it go. And in fact, she did dabble with, I'll come on to a couple of non-Jewish pen names, but in the end, she decided to assert that identity. This is a quotation by a curator of the first major multimedia exhibition about her in America. So one of my curatorial heroes, but actually a hero in a different way as well. He said you could call her transgressive, or you could call her a cross-dressing Man Ray with surrealist tendencies. I find this work really quite mad in the nicest way. Outside of France and now the UK, she's not had the kind of recognition that, as a founding follower, friend and worker of the original surrealist movement, she surely deserves. Well, I'm showing you this for a few reasons. One is because of her transgressive nature. The other is because he is contextualizing her as an original surrealist, and now that is how she is always seen. Although I'm in a minute going to also position her as part of that movement of the fin de siècle in France, the turn of the century, the 19th to the 20th century, that I think came before her surrealism and impacted it, but also because of who that curator is. And that curator is David Bowie. So I'm fascinated by the fact that the person who really blew up her reputation internationally was Bowie. I've got another photo of him here, someone who is also so conscious of his image, who plays with gender, who is very aware of how to look and how to be seen. In her own work, she's described herself or their self, and I'll come back to the pronoun in a minute, as masculine or feminine. It depends on the situation. Neuter is the only gender that always suits me. I know that Jeffrey is going to talk about this a lot later, but I just wanted to pop that in there to say there is a reason nowadays that a lot of curators, a lot of art historians refer to Claude Cahun by the plural pronoun or the neuter pronoun. I'm not going to, because I think it's a little bit anachronistic because of, in her own work, when she did use a pronoun, and she and Marcel used, or she and Suzanne used pronouns to each other, they did use she. So I will stick with that, but I just want to flash that up here, and that obviously kind of Claude Cahun has become really important to the queer movement. So here they are, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. And if you look at, in Paris, their memorial, this is the road named after them, the allée that is positioned near where they lived just when they were at the Sorbonne, and then in their few years in their 20s in Paris. They've called it Allée Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. They've stuck with the pen names, although underneath they've put Lucy Schwab and Suzanne Mallareb. Well, let's just look at who Lucy Schwab and Suzanne Mallareb were before they became Cahun and Moore. Very different images, although there we have Lucy is still staring directly at the camera, as is her cat, by the way. Cats figured big in their lives. They became friends when Claude was 15 and Suzanne was 17. And Suzanne really rescued, when Lucy was 15 and Suzanne was 17, Suzanne really rescued Lucy from loneliness. And that loneliness came from many reasons. Lucy had not had a very positive childhood. She was the child of Maurice Schwab, who was the owner of a journal, Le Phare de la Loire, and he was the managing editor, and he really directed this journal in Nantes, their political direction. It was liberal, it was open, and he was open about his Jewish identity and background. He was the only Jewish newspaper owner, general newspaper, not specifically Jewish newspaper. He was the only Jewish owner of a French newspaper at this time. And he became very public when all the other newspapers were going one way, he went the other. And the big thing that affected him happened in the year of Lucy's birth. In 1894, there was the Dreifus Affair. I'm sure many of you know about it. Maybe we'll talk about it a little later, but Captain Alfred Dreyfus was accused of treason. Military secrets had been leaked to the Germans. He was picked as the scapegoat. He was court-martialed and imprisoned. This kicked off a huge amount of anti-Semitism. In 1894, all the other newspapers were anti-Dreyfus. However, Maurice Schwab, from the very beginning, believed Dreyfus's claims of innocence, and he accused those hounding him of anti-Semitism. So Lucy was raised within an atmosphere of standing out. She was very aware of her own Jewish heritage from her father, and she was aware that it made her a target. There are countless tales of her being bullied at school. There's actually one incident which gets picked up. There's a novel written about her, which was published a couple of years ago by Rupert Thompson, and he picks up one incident and fictionalizes it, but it's absolutely based in truth, which is when she was tied by her peers at school to the trunk of a tree and had stones thrown at her because of her Jewishness and because of her father's position. She was also an outsider for another reason, and that was her mother. Her mother had a severe mental illness and actually spent the majority of Lucy's life in a sanatorium. So the Claude Cahun that becomes the resistance worker and propagandist on Jersey and is imprisoned by the Nazis comes from a background of always being the one to stand out, understanding what incarceration means and understanding what prejudice means. She is so unhappy. This is Dreyfus here. She is so unhappy that as things get worse As the Dreifus Affair gets much more publicity, the anti-Jewish sentiment is driven higher and higher. She asks her father to send her away, to get her out of the environment she's in Nantes. And he actually sends her to school in England, to Parsons Mead School in Surrey. So when there's that question asked in the film about why is she writing in English on her top, English is her safe place. England, polite England, is her safe space. You know, it's very different from the hostility she experiences in France. In England, she's an outsider because she's French, but not because she's Jewish. That comes second. She comes back to France as an Anglophile, but she doesn't have many friends. This is her at 15, 16, one of these first images we've got of her when she's meeting Suzanne in 1905. And she is, at this point, severely anorexic. She is abusing ether, probably. And her father gets Suzanne's mother to introduce them. Now, that's quite an interesting thing, because later on, her father and Suzanne's mother will marry each other once their respective spouses have died or divorced. So there is something that will happen later that suggests this initial conciliation between the parents, there might be more of an agenda to. But certainly what her father wants her is to have a friend relatively her own age. And Suzanne provides that. She provides now and for the rest of her life a safety net. So when Lucy chooses to rename herself Claude Cahun, she wants Suzanne to rename herself too. Suzanne becomes Marcel Moore, and the Marcel isn't her choice, but it's Claude's, it's Lucy's. Marcel comes from Claude Cahun, Lucy Schwab's uncle, Marcel Schwab. He is a French symbolist writer. His mother, Mathilde Cahoon, is who had really brought Claude or Lucy up so Lucy's grandmother, his mother is Lucy's grandmother, and she's really brought Claude up for most of her life. So he's quite close to them. And he is actually thought of as the father of surrealism in France and abroad. He's an influence on Borges, on Proust, Manet, Rodin. He's absolutely at the centre of France's cultured society. He's also fluent in English. His hero is Robert Louis Stevenson, but there's another writer I'm going to mention in a moment he helped translate into French, who is really key. And that's Oscar Wilde. In fact, Marcel Schwab is the person who translated Salome and helped Wilde stage it. The most famous actress in the part is Sarah Bernhardt, and it's Marcel Schwab who introduced them. Sarah Bernhardt, obviously also Jewish, someone who is very aware of her own identity. She will again and again, in the face of anti-Semitism, claim her Jewish identity. And she will also be very impacted by the Dreifus Affair. In fact, for her, it causes a split in her own family. Her son, her darling son, who is the one person she's closest to, will be anti-Dreyfus, but she will stand up for Dreyfus and insist on a rejection of anti-Semitism and fascism. This link of Maurice Schwab's to Wilde and Sarah Bernhardt, I think, is one of the major influences on Claude Cahun. Claude starts off, she takes the name Claude and she starts off looking at different surnames. She tries curly, or the word for curly, for a moment. She then goes, no, I'm Bossy. She sees herself as Wilde Bossy. This is Lord Alfred Douglas, or Bossy. And when she's at the Sorbonne, she submits work to various journals under the name of Douglas. Actually, she goes Daniel Douglas. She loves alliteration. So her premier identity at that point is of part of a same-sex couple. And she sees herself as the younger one. Suzanne is older. She sees herself as him, as Alfred Douglas potentially vulnerable, potentially dangerous. He's the one who gets Oscar Wilde in trouble. We don't know whether she submits work under the male name because she's at that point playing with masculinity, or much like George Eliot, being a woman, it's very hard to get things published. But she will then go back to Claude and Cahun. She chooses Cahoon. She rejects Douglas and she goes for Cahoon because of the Jewish identity. It is as much of a driving force for her as her sexuality. This is her great uncle, David Léon Cahoon. And he is another influence on her. She never met him, but the memory of him impacts her throughout her life, because he was a wandering traveller who wrote accounts of all sorts of countries. But when he came back to France, he decided that the most important thing in his life was to become a political writer. He saw the beginnings of fascism rising, and he made it his mission to join a newspaper that was anti-fascist, or that's slightly anachronistic, but the beginnings of fascism, that was anti-nationalism. He was very much a part of his Jewish family. He had Jewish practice. In fact, he's descended from a rabbi in Frankfurt, and she would cling to that. So this idea of being revolutionary, political, and Jewish, I think, is all embedded in why she takes the name Claude Cahun. She does become a surrealist. You've seen her pictures. I'm going to leave us today with the pictures of a couple of the surrealist artists she befriends, Henri Michaud and André Breton, and Marcel Moore befriends as well. I've not talked much about Marcel Moore, but Marcel is a graphic designer. She is visual. Claude Cahun at this point provides the words in Paris, and Marcel or Suzanne provides the images. They're obvious people you would have thought they would have befriended were Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, but Gertrude Stein was irascible, not pleasant to them. They ended up among the circle of surrealist men, but their patience with them, particularly Claude Cahun's patience with them, began to dim in the 30s. She saw the rise of Nazism as a massive threat to her and to France. They weren't as alarmed as she was. They would become so later, but they didn't see the warning signs. And that was one of the reasons she broke away from them. And she and Marcel decided to move from what seemed to be their safe cultured circle in Paris to Jersey. She spoke English. Jersey was an English-speaking place, and it seemed to her as the perfect median between Paris and England. So on that note, I'm going to pause and to take us to Jersey, pass you over to Jeffrey Jackson, who I think Monica will now introduce.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Aviva. Good. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our star speaker for today, speaking all the way from Memphis, Tennessee. God bless Zoom. It does make certain things possible and in a rather wonderful way. So Jeffrey H. Jackson, is professor of history at Rhodes College, Memphis, Tennessee, where he teaches courses on modern European history, cultural history, French history, environmental studies, and interdisciplinary humanities. He's the author of a number of fascinating sounding publications, aside from the one which is our main focus today. Among them, Paris Underwater, How the City of Light Survived the Great Flood of 1910, and also Making Jazz French, Music and Modern Life in Interwar Paris. In addition, he's co-edited a number of interesting volumes, The Thinking Space, the Cafe as Cultural Institution in Paris, Vienna, and Italy, as well as Music and History, Bridging the Disciplines, and also The Underground Reader, Sources in the Transatlantic Counterculture. His articles have appeared in leading academic journals, and he's also a sought-after public speaker and commentator who's appeared in documentary films, on television, and has been interviewed on radio and also podcasts. Most relevant to us, his most recent book, Paper Bullets, The Artists Who Risked Their Lives to Defy the Nazis, published by Algonquin Books, really quite recently in November 2020, was longlisted for the 2021 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Non-Fiction, and also selected as an editor's choice as best of the best for 2020 by Booklist. Jeffrey, it's my great pleasure to hand over to you.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful and very generous introduction. And thank you all for the invitation. It's a great honor to join you tonight, to speak to you tonight. I wish I could be with you in London. As you say, it is the miracle of Zoom that I can still be with you, even under these circumstances, but it really is a great pleasure to do that. What I'd like to do is to show you some images and talk a little bit about these two remarkable women that we've already heard a little bit about, and there will be a little bit of overlap between what has been said and what I'm going to talk about, but that's actually a good thing because it will help us to sort of deepen our understanding, but also because I think one of the points that I'm going to make throughout my presentation is that there is a continuity between their Paris life and their Jersey experience. So that, you know, I have to go back to talk a little bit about their trajectory and what gets them to Jersey, what gets them to the place of resistance. And I think Aviva's comments, I really appreciate that presentation that you did. That was really wonderful, and also helps to set up some key themes that I will come back to and echo and hopefully deepen. And then we can talk more about those things in the question and answer. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, here we go. All right, sorry about that. Technology is wonderful, isn't it? So I want to tell you a little bit more about these two remarkable women that we've already been talking a little bit about, and to give you some additional thoughts about them. And if you know something about art, and especially the history of photography, then you may have heard of them before tonight. But even if you know their work, you may not know much about the story of how and why they fought the Nazis for 4 years. This story really has inspired me and lots of other people that I've talked to over the years, and so I'm very glad to be able to share it with you tonight. Lucy Schwab and Suzanne Mallareb were in many ways two of the most unlikely Nazi fighters that many of you perhaps have never heard of before. They were Parisian artists. Lucy was a writer and Suzanne was an illustrator who had studied in art school when she was young. And together, the two of them would collaborate on what many people in their own day saw as some sometimes shocking photographs. They were friends with and influenced by many of the great modern artists in Paris of their day: Picasso, André Breton, Salvador Dali, Jean Cocteau. But their images turned ideas of gender and identity on their heads. More than anything, that's what they're known for today. Known, of course, by different names, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, and I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. But after they left Paris and the art world behind, they put their skills as artists to work, fighting against the German army on the island of Jersey. They used their creative powers to get inside the heads of soldiers. In brief, here's how it worked. Lucy and Suzanne created a PSYOPs campaign, a psychological operations campaign, designed to demoralize soldiers, telling them that the war was a lost cause and trying to convince them to go home to their families. And they did it in a very unexpected way, by writing notes, messages, summaries of BBC News reports, drawings, songs, bawdy jokes, and provocative slogans, all written or typed on little slips of paper like the one that you see on your screen. And they left them for the Germans to find. In some cases, they even put their notes directly into the pockets of German soldiers themselves. And what I'd like to do is I want to read a few excerpts of the book. And I want to begin with an excerpt that's the very beginning, the opening scene of the book. And I wanted to read this partly to show you how I tell their story, but also to give a sense of the drama that was part of their work. On the morning of July 25th, 1944, Lucy Schwab and Suzanne Mallareb went into Saint-Hélier to do some shopping. The trip was part of their regular routine. Outside the offices of the Jersey Evening Post, they glanced up at the large clock at the top of the building. Suzanne leaned in and whispered to Lucy to keep watch. Then Suzanne scanned the long row of police cars the Nazi occupation forces always parked along Charles Street, a reminder of how heavily the Germans censored the island's only newspaper. Suzanne took a small piece of paper out of her pocket and began moving carefully toward one of the police cars as Lucy stood by on lookout duty. Suzanne stuck the gummed paper on the windshield. It read, "The cowardly bureaucrats of the police who live on lies and shameful cruelty will be destroyed by the soldiers with no names." No one seemed to be paying any attention to the middle-aged women in Burberry trench coats with bright scarves tied around their heads. Suzanne quickly attached papers to a few more windshields and casually strolled away, her Wellington boots thumping on the pavement. If anyone asked the women what they were doing, their shopping bag would provide a ready alibi. After finishing their secret mission, along with some mundane errands, they met up with their housekeeper, Edna, and boarded one of the wood-burning buses to head back home on the other side of the island. Lucy held a package of cigarette papers they had just bought at the newsstand. These papers were destined to become a new batch of notes for the Nazis. In her pocket, alongside more of their notes, Suzanne could feel the bright blue milk of magnesia bottle. It did not contain the digestive medicine, however, but instead an overdose of the powerful barbiturate Gardinol, in case the Germans caught them in the act. With no warning, the bus came to an abrupt halt, and a fair-haired soldier climbed aboard. Everyone off the bus. Lucy clutched her parcel a bit tighter. Outside, the soldier approached each commuter. Please show me your papers. How old are you? What is your occupation? Where were you born? Where do you live? How many children do you have? With his critical eye, the German carefully looked over each passenger's documents until satisfied, saying very little other than what was necessary to get his answers. If something was suspicious, or if passengers had forgotten their documents, they were told, someone will visit you in your home. Then the soldier approached Lucy and Suzanne. Lucy recalled the scene several years later in a scrapbook of notes that might have formed the basis of a memoir if she had lived long enough. She titled these reminiscences "The Mute in the Middle of the Muddle." Show me your registration card, the German demanded. He stood in front of Lucy, glaring at her. A look of recognition crossed his face when he saw a familiar name, Schwab. What kind of name is that? The document listed French as her national origin. She explained nervously that she was an orphan and raised by a Frenchman. Perhaps you were an Alsatian. Maybe, she replied, but admitted that she really didn't know. Lucy stated that she had been on Jersey for some 30 years. Nearly everything she had just told the German about herself was a calculated lie. She invented a new backstory for herself, and not for the first time. As the minutes ticked by, Lucy waited patiently next to the bus and watched the soldier scrutinize her documents. Suzanne and Edna were close by but could do nothing to help. Lucy, perhaps coughing or stumbling a bit, played sick for the Germans' benefit, brushing off her acting skills from her Paris days when she took part in avant-garde theater productions. Finally, the soldier handed back Lucy's papers. When he wrapped up his examination of all the passengers, everyone reboarded the bus. An acquaintance riding with them tried to break the nervous tension created by the ordeal. They have not caught you this time, she said, laughing, unaware of what Lucy's parcel of cigarette papers was destined for. Now, I'll tell you more about how they did all of this in a moment, but first I want to tell you a little bit about their background, because one of the questions that I had to think about was, why would two women with so much to lose put their lives on the line in the way that they did? And also I had to consider, what was it about who they were that gave them the strength and the power to become resistors? Because after all, most people did not become resistors during World War II. Well, I think part of the answer to those questions lies in their personal histories. As we've heard already tonight, Lucy and Suzanne grew up around the turn of the century in the southern French city of Nantes as daughters of wealth and privilege. Lucy's father was a newspaper owner and editor, and Suzanne's was the head of the medical school and a well-known physician. So they were never starving artists, even when they moved to Paris as young women in their 20s, just after World War I, to pursue their artistic careers, because they always had family resources. One reason they did not become famous in their day, even in the art world, is that they never really needed to publicize their work in order to make money. They were known, of course, in certain circles, especially among the surrealists with whom they were friends, but for decades they were largely forgotten until being rediscovered in the 1980s. Yet to become resistors, they would need to give up the privilege and the comfort that they were born with. But why would they? Well, there were some key things about their life stories, which, although they did not know it at the time, would set the stage for their resistance against the Nazis. First of all, as we've heard, Lucy's father's family was Jewish. Although he was assimilated and didn't practice the faith, Lucy embraced elements of her Jewish identity that were taught to her, especially by her grandmother. There were also several rabbis and scholars of Jewish life in the family. Lucy was 4 years old at the height of one of the worst anti-Semitic episodes in modern French history, the Dreifus Affair. That, of course, is a very complicated story. We've heard a little bit about it. It's a very complicated historical episode, and we can talk more about it later if anyone would like. But in the context of Lucy's story, it led to crowds outside the family's apartment shouting, "Down with the Jews." And later, when Lucy was 12, she was attacked by other children in school who pelted her with rocks and anti-Semitic taunts while she lay helpless on the ground. Lucy and Suzanne both would remember those horrible days, and the memory would fuel their hatred of fascism and their willingness to fight it. A second factor that allowed them to become resistors was the fact that they were in love. Lucy and Suzanne had met as young girls in the elite circles of Nantes society and had played together from childhood. By the time they were teenagers, they began a relationship that was in tension with a conservative French Catholic society that valued respectability. Most people in France at the turn of the century did not see a lesbian couple as respectable. Their connection was made even more complicated by the fact that in 1917, Lucy's divorced father married Suzanne's widowed mother, making the girls stepsisters. But their feelings were powerful. Lucy wrote in a thinly veiled article published in a Nantes-based literary journal that her feelings for Suzanne were her idée maîtresse, her main idea, and her guiding principle. I am in her, she is in me, and I will follow her always, never losing sight of her. And this image that you see on the right-hand side of your screen, you saw it in the video a little bit earlier. And again, you can maybe get a better look at it compared to the video, but you see the letters LS and SM at the top intertwined. Those are their initials, Lucy, Schwab, Suzanne, Mallareb, intertwined. And when read phonetically in French, it creates the sentence, Elles s'aiment, they love each other. Now, drawing on their own experiences, Lucy and Suzanne also explore gender and sexuality as fluid and changing categories. This is one of the things that they're most famous for today. And as we learned tonight, they're not known in the art world as Lucy and Suzanne, but rather by their gender-neutral artistic names, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. In French, it really should be pronounced Claude Cahun, but most people that I encounter pronounce it as Claude Cahun, and I'll do that as well. They assume these names to create new identities and to cross gender lines. Claude in particular is a name that's used by both men and women in French. Cahoon put it this way in a memoir that she published in 1930, masculine, feminine, it depends on the situation. Neuter is the only gender that always suits me. If it existed in our language, no one would be able to see my thoughts' vacillation. So gender was for Cahoon situational, conditional, fluid, depending on the moment. Lucy's new name also allowed her to express her Jewishness. It was as much about Jewishness as it was about gender. Cahoon was the name of one set of Lucy's grandparents, in particular, the grandmother who taught her about Judaism. Cahoon is the French version of Cohen, the Hebrew for priest. And like many other artists of the day, they created work under new names, but these identities also allowed the women to slip the trap of traditional bourgeois society. Throughout their lives, they always called one another Lucy and Suzanne, and the historical documents are very clear on this point. Those are the names on their tombstone. We tend to call them Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore because we know them primarily through their art. I usually, in the book, call them Lucy and Suzanne because I'm dealing mostly with their post-Paris lives. But if you've seen their work under the names of Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, you know the ways in which their photographs depict Claude Cahun, Lucy, in gender-ambiguous dress or pose, playing with notions of masculinity and femininity, in some ways helping to invent the notion of what we would now call queerness, long before our current understanding of that idea was created. In fact, many queer and transgender people today see them as early heroes and role models. Their photos deconstructed gender categories, showing them to be masquerade and performance decades before scholars would take up those questions. Cahoon put it this way in her autobiography: I shave my head, wrench out my teeth, my breasts, anything that is embarrassing or annoying to look at, stomach, ovaries, the brain, conscious and covered in cysts, suggesting that altering gender and sexual identity was part of the goal, and so was creating a new self. And I've always been struck by this, the quote from David Bowie as well, known for his own gender ambiguity. As he put it, I find this work really quite mad in the nicest way. Now that ability, though, to cross gender lines that Bowie was talking about and that others have talked about, that ability to cross gender lines will become crucial to Lucy and Suzanne's fight against the Nazis. So keep that in mind as I begin to talk about their time in Jersey. So Lucy and Suzanne spent the 1920s and most of the 1930s in Paris, but they decamped to the island of Jersey in 1937 when they were both in their late 40s. They had vacationed on Jersey many times over the years, so its beaches and its natural beauty were very familiar to them. It was a perfect respite for Lucy's chronic ill health. She had a number of medical conditions through which Suzanne had helped to nurse her over the years. And Paris had become deeply politically polarized by the 1930s, with various groups literally fighting in the streets. And with fascism on the rise across Europe, Jersey offered a peaceful escape. So when they left Paris and the art world behind, they stopped using the names Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore and returned almost exclusively to their birth names, Lucy and Suzanne. But little did they know that when they moved to Jersey, they were stepping into what would soon become a war zone. When the fighting broke out in Poland in 1939, Jersey seemed far away from the action, but by 1940, the Channel Islands would become the front lines. The islands were the only piece of British soil that the Nazis conquered, and they were crucial to what Hitler called his Atlantic Wall, a line of defense in the West designed to keep the Allies at bay. Thousands of German troops soon arrived in Lucy and Suzanne's adopted home to build fortifications, which would be used to protect the continent from Allied assault. It was so important that Hitler personally received regular updates from the islands. No dissent could be tolerated in such a strategically important location. But dissent is exactly what Lucy and Suzanne did. Back in Paris, they had been involved in left-wing politics, befriending communists and other radicals. They had signed petitions and open letters against the rise of fascism and protesting anti-immigrant legislation. Lucy had written a letter to a magazine supporting gay rights. So by the time they arrived on Jersey, they had been rebels for some time. Add to that their own lives as lesbian partners lived in opposition to the mores of their day, and their provocative artwork that challenged notions of beauty and gender identity. Ultimately, all of the strands of their lives came together to not only give them the strength to resist the German occupation of Jersey, but to give them the skills to do so. They put their creative talents, their political inclinations, and their personal backgrounds to work, into their work, and it gave them the tools to fight back. Resistance was not an afterthought, but the peak and the point of their creative lives. Most importantly, their love kept them going as they supported one another through what were some very scary and some very stressful moments. I really don't believe that either woman could have done this work alone. Just like their art, which was a complete collaboration, their resistance was something that came out of their relationship and their love. Now, as I said before, their desire to resist led them to write notes to the Nazis, something that on the face of it seems small and even inconsequential. But the notes that they wrote were powerful indeed. All of these messages were designed to demoralize the troops, or to convince them to desert, or to mutiny, or to go back to their families in Germany. And the German army took them very seriously. For 4 years, the secret field police, which was tasked with keeping order in occupied territory, tracked them, trying to find out who was leaving all these notes around the island. Sometimes the agents would find them on fence posts, sometimes on cafe tables, sometimes tucked into magazines and newsstands, sometimes placed inside German staff cars parked along the streets, and sometimes even in their own pockets. The women even hung up a sarcastic banner over the altar at the church near their house where some of the soldiers worshiped, reading, "Jesus is great, but Hitler is greater, because Jesus died for people, but people die for Hitler." And what they were doing with these messages was scaring the German command into believing that a conspiracy was afoot on the island, this strategically important zone about which Hitler received regular updates. Was there someone on the island threatening the Atlantic Wall that protected Hitler's conquered continent from Allied attack? The notes only stoked the Germans' paranoia. Now, the notes that frightened the Germans the most were the ones that Lucy and Suzanne signed, but not with their own name, rather with the name of an author that they had invented. They created a fictional persona and pretended to write messages from that perspective in German, since Suzanne was fluent. But the persona was significant. They called him the soldier with no name. In other words, they crossed gender lines once again, this time in effect becoming, so to speak, a German soldier. When they wrote notes in this male German voice aimed at the other soldiers, they made the secret police believe that the threat was coming from within the German army itself. And this, I think, was one of their innovations. Note writing was not unique to them. There are many cases of people living in German occupied territory, and even within Nazi Germany itself, writing notes as a form of dissent. But most of those notes were aimed at the civilian population, reminding them to keep their spirits up or calling on them to resist the Nazis. As far as I can tell, Lucy and Suzanne were unique as civilians aiming their notes at the German soldiers. The only real parallel was the Allied PSYOPs campaign, which dropped German language leaflets behind enemy lines, encouraging soldiers to desert or to surrender. So what Lucy and Suzanne were doing here was effectively rewriting the inner script that the Germans told themselves about how the war was going. They were getting inside the minds of the soldiers and sowing seeds of doubt and dissension, spreading ideas that they hoped would go viral, so to speak, among the troops. If a German soldier read their notes, signed by the soldier with no name, and believed that they really were written by a comrade, Lucy and Suzanne hoped that he might think twice about what he was doing on Jersey. Maybe he would even mutiny or desert. Now, of course, I don't have time to tell you the whole story tonight, but suffice it to say that they were indeed arrested by the secret field police, interrogated, put on trial on November 16, 1944, just over 76 years ago. And then they were sent to prison and sentenced to death. And I'd like to read a second excerpt from the book, again, just to give you sort of a taste of how that played out. This is one of the scene, or part of the scene of their trial. On a table lay all of the confiscated items, or excuse me, on a table lay all the items confiscated during the raid, including their Philips radio, their Underwood typewriter and Kodak camera, 2 guns, books, articles published by Lucy's father, one of Suzanne's wooden crosses that Lucy had planted on a soldier's fresh grave, pieces of fabric, and a few of the coins on which the women had painted "Down with War" with nail polish. These once familiar things now seemed strange, so out of context in a courtroom rather than at home. This collection looks like a sort of junk shop, Lucy Riley thought. Also on the table sat the secret field police chief's fat file, which was packed with their notes. The approximately 300 scraps of paper now entered into evidence were only a fraction of what they had produced, 1/20th, Lucy claimed. Her estimate was different from what Suzanne recalled, but of course neither had really been counting. The other noteworthy feature in the room was the 3/4 length portrait of Hitler that hung over the fireplace. He appeared to be presiding over the trial. Lucy recalled the large windows of the courtroom filled with sunshine from the beautiful day outside, even describing the room as hot. What a luxury, she thought, compared with their cold prison cells. 2 large, comfortable armchairs in the front row next to one another. What a delight. We are at the show, Lucy remembered, with more than a bit of sarcasm. The decor, the actors did not disappoint us. When it came time to pass sentence, the presiding judge was blunt. You are franc-tireur, he declared, using the French term for guerrilla fighters or irregular military shooters, even though you used spiritual arms instead of firearms. He gave a brief summary on why their actions were so significant and why he had condemned them as dangerous political criminals. It is indeed a more serious crime, he claimed. With firearms, one knows at once what damage has been done, but with spiritual arms, one cannot tell how far-reaching it may be. Lucy could not help but think, we couldn't have put our defense any better ourselves. So even during their time in prison, Lucy and Suzanne kept up their efforts at defying the Nazis. As they befriended guards, they passed notes and comforted other prisoners. The book that I wrote is full of surprising episodes of what took place in those moments. German guards, both frightening and humane, prisoners keeping one another's spirits up with singing, Lucy and Suzanne smuggling notes to one another in the middle of the night, tales of German deserters being hauled off to their execution, leaving the women to wonder when their turn before the firing squad would come. But there's one story in particular that stands out because I think it highlights how important their relationship, their love story, was to making all of this happen. As Lucy was being interrogated by the secret police, she made a stunning admission. She blurted out, "I am on my father's side of Jewish origin." So she admitted to being an unregistered Jew living in Nazi-occupied territory, thereby putting herself in grave danger. Then she confessed to the supposed crime, telling her interrogator that she wrote all the notes by herself and that the whole thing was her idea. She was trying to convince her interrogators that she alone had the motive to become the soldier with no name. But in reality, she was not claiming credit for their work as the true mastermind behind their campaign, as some scholars have believed. In fact, Lucy knew just how much of their resistance Suzanne was responsible for. Lucy herself wrote that it was more often me who accompanied Suzanne, she who took the initiative, which required the most sang-froid. Instead, Lucy's calculated risk in admitting her Jewishness was really an attempt to take the fall and save Suzanne. If the police believed that Lucy alone had a motive to write their notes, then the woman she loved might somehow get off. Lucy and Suzanne survived the war, but they had to work hard to make sense of it. What had it all meant? After all, they did not drive the Germans from Jersey with their notes. But in some very important, very personal ways, their effort was a success. And it's something that speaks to us today about the power of creativity and imagination and persistence, especially in trying times. I think they've left us a story about how even small acts of protest and refusal can have significant effects that are hard to see until later. And I think they remind us why history matters. Because in the midst of our present day difficulties, a global pandemic, deep political polarization, economic uncertainty, we can look back to the stories of people who had it far worse, but who still somehow survived. So I want to close with a final excerpt from the book where I talk about how Lucy and Suzanne tried to make some sense of what they had gone through. Throughout the years that followed the war, Lucy wrote about it in lengthy letters to friends and in early drafts of what might have become a memoir had she lived longer. These writings were not the sort of quest for personal identity that she had composed as a young woman in the 1920s and 1930s, but were rather an attempt to make sense of what the war and their time in prison had meant in broader, more universal terms, despite her underlying fear that there was no such meaning to be made. But there had been a point behind what they did. Lucy wrote in a 1950 letter, "From July 1940, the invasion of Jersey, until May 1945, the liberation of the Channel Islands, yes, even in prison, even in secret, I wrote to encourage men, including the German soldiers, to liberate themselves." Whether such self-liberation took place was easy to doubt, yet there were occasional glimpses of something that might offer a larger perspective and a sense perhaps of vindication. In January 1946, for example, Suzanne received a letter in German from a POW military hospital. It was from Heinrich Ebers, one of the men who had guarded Lucy and Suzanne in prison. Surely German jailers did not typically write to their former inmates. His family was alive and in good health, he reported, and the British were treating him well. He asked Suzanne to greet Lucy and to write him back. In some strange way, perhaps Heinrich, the German guard, had liberated himself and wanted them to know it. Lucy and Suzanne had liberated themselves through their resistance work too. Lucy in particular had struggled with the question of identity her whole life, from her youth in an assimilated Jewish household during the heat of the Dreyfus Affair, to her struggles with her mother's mental illness and her own poor health. Her early writing was inwardly focused and tortured, extended attempts to answer the question, who am I? Which neither her essays and her book, nor her evolving self-presentation, her numerous aliases and radical politics could ever seem to resolve. She was always looking for more. Lucy finally found her identity through The Soldier with No Name, and so did Suzanne. The war was the one moment in their lives when they seemed to have the strongest sense of purpose and the most direct vision about who they wanted to be. Against the Nazis, there was a moral clarity and certainty, which their earlier work did not always have. The Soldier with No Name finally liberated them to speak as loudly and as distinctly as they wanted. Well, that's my presentation for tonight, and I think I'll hand it back over and we can have some discussion. Let me stop my screen share here, and I'll turn it back over to Monica, and we'll follow your lead. Thank you all very much.
Very good. Well, thank you very, very much, Jeffrey. That was totally fascinating and extremely thought-provoking, as I'm sure everybody will agree. And I simply don't believe that there aren't any questions. I've already urged people to start typing them in, so please do. I'll set the ball rolling perhaps with some quite, well, they're not mundane, but sort of quite sort of basic questions, I suppose, to do with the time in Jersey. Interrelated ones, actually. Is there any evidence, as far as you're aware, of what they did this, you know, the steps they took, of their success in inciting any sense of unrest, rebellion, mutiny, even the possibility of desertion among the German soldiery in Jersey? Or is
that's a great question. And there are a couple of examples of men that they encountered, people that they spoke with. There was one soldier that they met in prison who had read their notes, was familiar with what they were saying. There are a few scattered things like that. Unfortunately, I don't have German sources. You know, the soldiers didn't leave behind documents that would say more about what kinds of response that they had upon seeing these notes. For many soldiers, I'm sure the reaction was to get rid of it, to throw it away, dispose of it, burn it. And many, of course, also turned it over to the secret field police. So I think there was certainly a concern about that. They would not have wanted to have those notes to be found by their superior officers with those notes on their person. So the tendency, I'm sure, was to get rid of them. But one thing that I always point out is that if the Germans, if this had been meaningless from the Germans' point of view, they wouldn't have hunted them for 4 years. I think the fact that the secret field police was looking for them, looking for the author of these notes for so long, suggests to me just how seriously they took this. And so whether, we can't really trace exactly what kind of impact that it had on any individual soldier, but the significant concern on the part of the secret field police and of the German military leaders led them to, just always looking for, because the notes would continue to appear on a regular basis as well. So they knew this, whoever was writing these notes was an active writer. And so it just, again, like I said, it stoked their paranoia.
No, it's quite clear that the authorities took the challenge very seriously, but I can't help wondering, and maybe this is playing the devil's advocate slightly, if there wasn't an element of, dare I say it, naivety in their sense that they could change the mindset of the Germans, and whether that in fact was only possible because they weren't fully aware of what the Germans were doing elsewhere in Europe.
Well, you're certainly right. I think that they didn't have a broader sense necessarily of what was happening in terms of the war as a whole. They were listening secretly to BBC radio, and so they were certainly getting information that way. But that was also not the entire story. I point out, for example, in the book that BBC was very unwilling to talk about the extermination camps. The BBC was not really willing to talk about anti-Jewish atrocities. So they were certainly not getting the whole story there. In terms of their what they thought about what they were doing, I addressed this a little bit in the book by talking about one of the essays that Lucy writes when they're in Paris. She writes this essay that in which she talks about this idea, what she calls the indirect effect. It's part of a conversation, it's part of a debate that she's having with various artists in Paris about what should be the role of an artist in political times. How should artists engage in politics? And some people were saying we should be very direct, we should be very blunt, we should be very bold. Lucy's take on this is much more subtle, much more psychological, you might say. Basically, her position is that propaganda doesn't work, that things that are too bold, too in your face don't work because someone might read it and just sort of reject it out of hand. What she prefers is what she coins this phrase, the indirect effect. And what she means by that is this idea that if you plant a seed, if you sort of get someone to think about something at a different level, that maybe not immediately, but over time, that it will have this kind of working inside the mind of someone else. And that it will pay off benefits in the longer term. So she's writing this in Paris in the 30s. She has no idea that they'll have an opportunity to put this into effect, or into practice rather. But she's already sort of conceptualized this idea about how she believes, at least, that the artist should go about this kind of political work. So, however you want to call that, naivete or subtlety or whatever it might be, that was something very much coming out of her own perspective.
Indeed. On the back of that, I'm also curious to know more about the other forms of resistance that were taking place, presumably on the island, that presumably took very different forms. I wonder if you could just tell us a little about that.
That's right. There were other people writing notes as well, although Lucy and Suzanne were not connected with them at all. They were very clear that the work that they did on their own. They did not want to endanger other people. They did not want to put anyone else at risk. And so they worked on their own. But there were other kinds of resistance in addition to note writing as well. There were certainly people who were engaged in various acts of sabotage, going slow at work, stealing food, trying to do anything that they could to slow down or to undermine the German military presence there. One of the things about resistance on the Channel Islands in Jersey in particular, is that they were not able to do any kind of coordinated resistance. So you don't have, unlike the French resistance, for example, or other examples of, you know, groups that get together and work together for the purpose of resisting the German occupation. They're not able to do that on Jersey, in part because the island is small and the German presence is so large. That there was really not any way to do that without arousing the suspicion of the German occupation force. So what you would find might be pairs like Lucy and Suzanne, perhaps small groups, sometimes families, family units would be involved in some kind of resistance on their own. And Lucy and Suzanne even talk about some of those multiple family members. They met several people in prison who were members of the same family who had all been arrested because they were engaged in some kind of resistance act. Again, it could be looting, it could be sabotage, you know, something on a more small scale.
Good. We have a few questions coming in. Let me just take a quick look. Yes, a very specific question about the use of German. They wrote, and I think it was actually Marcel, it was actually Suzanne, wasn't it, who was the German speaker?
That's right.
But was this normal? Was it normal for French people to learn German? And indeed, how come Suzanne was such a good German speaker?
Well, Suzanne had an Alsatian governess when she was young. And so her governess had taught her German. I think it was probably relatively unusual. In fact, I would say it was quite unusual, especially in this period, because the tensions between the French and the Germans were so high in the late 19th century in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War. That's the context for the Dreyfus Affair as well, is that there's this deep hatred between France and Germany in this period. Germany has taken Alsace and Lorraine, those eastern territories, from France, and now they're part of a newly unified Germany right on France's doorstep. And so so the idea of learning German would not be something you would do, you know, as part of a regular school education because of that animosity. So I think it was sort of a quirk of the circumstance that Suzanne had happened to have a German-speaking governess from Alsace who lived with her family and helped to raise her. And she speaks very highly and kindly, and I talk about in the book some of her memories of her governess, but it gave her a skill that it turns out became very useful in this situation
as well, isn't it? Absolutely. A question which I think in large measure you've already answered, but from somebody called John Dray. I love the pun around resistors and sisters. Is that resistors? Yeah, sisters and resistors. But to what extent did their struggle against the Nazis reflect their struggle, in inverted commas, with sex, sexuality, gender, and the general public, or were they just wholly accepted?
You mean on Jersey?
Well, I'm not sure what John was getting at there, but I think he probably means it in a wider sense, but maybe not. John, would you like to chip in? I think the idea was indeed to unmute the questioners if you would like to have your say.
Sorry, yes, I was thinking sort of in a broader sense, really. It was the idea that sort of did they have a general struggle in life, sort of, because their way of living wasn't necessarily generally accepted, and did that in some way sort of prepare them for the struggle against the Nazis because they were used to resisting the general society?
No, I think that's a great point, and I think that is kind of how I came to talk about it in the book. That really part of what allows them or equips them to become resistors when they are on Jersey is the fact that they have been fighting in some way for a long time, and that's certainly true in their youth. You know, they were a couple and they were recognized as a couple, but even in Paris, that was not necessarily an easy thing. You know, Paris was more open, certainly, to same-sex couples. There was a larger gay and lesbian scene in Paris in the 1920s, but it was not universally accepted by any means. In fact, there were plenty of people in Paris which, you know, we think of, especially in that period, as being more open and more tolerant. There were many people in Paris who looked, who saw lesbians really as a threat, gay men and lesbians both, as a significant threat, if for no other reason than that, again, connected to the recent war experience, the Franco-Prussian War. One of the things that, and of World War I as well, both of those wars that France had gone through, is that many people said, you know, we need babies, we need the next generation of soldiers, and lesbians and gay men are not doing their part to increase the population. So that was one of several reasons, certainly not the only reason, but one of several reasons why there was a kind of suspicion on the part of mainstream society. So I think there were many battles that they saw themselves fighting, many ways in which they were trying to navigate through their own identities, through gender issues, through sexuality, through politics, through art. And of course, we think about, you know, that avant-garde art scene. It's an amazing and rich and wonderful moment, and we now, of course, take a lot of inspiration from that. But that doesn't mean, you know, surrealism was not universally accepted in Paris either in the 1920s, 1930s. So many people saw it as ugly, as shocking, as you know, as horrifying. And actually, when I first started this book, someone, in the very early on in the process, I was seeking some advice, and someone said to me, upon looking at their photographs, said, "These photographs are ugly. Why would you want to write about them?" So it's interesting that even today, people still sometimes have those kinds of responses, and certainly that was the case in Paris at the time too. So I think your point about struggle and conflict really is sort of embedded in their narrative, and that's why, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, I felt like I had to talk about their lives as a whole, as a continuous arc. That you can't really separate the Paris life from the Jersey life. That to me, this is all, I mean, part of that's because they're, you know, it's two lives lived in full. But I think that the time in Paris, unknowingly, of course, for them, but ends up preparing them for what they will end up doing in Jersey.
One could perhaps just add to that, of course, surrealism intended to shock the, you know, épater the bourgeoisie. I mean, that was very much part and parcel of what they were up to. But also, I think, intriguingly, and I think to me quite mysteriously, Breton, of course, was quite antipathetic to same-sex relationships, which is almost a contradiction in terms, isn't it? So it's not as simple as it might at first appear. There's a very different sort of question here about their post-war artistic lives. Could you say a little bit more about that?
After World War II?
After World War II.
So after the war, I didn't do as much reading on that part of their lives, but you certainly don't see them producing nearly as much work. I mean, we saw a few of the images. I showed a couple. The one of them walking their cat. That's from after the war, actually. Most of the images that I've seen from after the war tend to be much more sort of personal images, much less of sort of the artistic work, more snapshots, more just kind of, you know, scenes of them on the beach and enjoying their freedom after the war. And then, of course, part of the problem too is that Lucy has had many chronic health issues over the years. That goes back to her childhood. And her time in prison really exacerbates that illness. The air in the prison the prison cell is dusty, it's dirty, it's cold, it's damp. It certainly doesn't help her physical condition. So by the time she's released, she talks about it in some of her post-war writing. She talks about her sicknesses. She talks about really sort of being confined at one point to the house. So I get the sense that they're really not producing nearly as much work, that what they're doing is really just trying to recover. They're just trying to kind of get back some semblance of life. A part of the time spent after the war is also just getting back all of their possessions, because the Germans had looted their house. They'd taken all of their things away. And they were able to recover many of those things, but they had to go all around the island finding these things because the Germans had moved them, or other people on Jersey had taken them. I mean, there were massive shortages, significant shortages. And so others ended up with some of their belongings. And so a lot of that time was just spent trying to kind of regain their lives. After Lucy dies, Suzanne does continue to take photographs. Really, Suzanne was always the one behind the camera. Suzanne was the one clicking the shutter. And you see that she continues to take some photographs later in life, but they tend to be nature scenes of the beach, scenes of Jersey. They don't usually have people in them. They just tend to be more nature photography. So very different work, very different vision after the war, for sure.
This question of the nature of their collaboration is also, I think, crucial, and we haven't perhaps grappled with it as much as we might. I mean, it seems to me sort of faintly depressing that here you have in this utterly unconventional couple, still the one who gets all the publicity, all the limelight, and it's such a stereotypical situation in artist relationships of, you know, two separate sort of genders and sexualities. Is it fair that Claude Cahun has garnered most of the attention? I know your book tries to address the balance, but nevertheless, the tendency is to give Claude most of the credit.
You're right. And I one of the things that I felt like I was trying to do in the book, I didn't start out this way, but as I went along and began to look at the documents and began to consider the issues, one of the things that I kind of felt that I was trying to do ultimately was to restore Suzanne to this story. That Cahoon really has gotten the credit. And if you look at, if you see in museums and in collections and galleries, almost always traditionally these images have been credited to Claude Cahun alone, and Moore gets erased. I actually, for anyone who's interested in reading more about this, I just published an article a couple of weeks ago on a website, the website called lithub.com. You can find the link from my website, jeffreyhjackson.com, if you click under the section that says essays and interviews, and you can read more about some more in-depth thoughts on my take on this, although I do talk about it in the book. For me, though, the basic point of that was to say that for me, this really was a collaboration. And I personally really believe, and other scholars as well, believe that really we should be talking about them as a 100% collaborative unit. And it's difficult, I think, because it does go against our traditional understanding about how art is produced, about creativity. You know, I think Cahoon sort of fits the stereotype of the bohemian artist in many ways. She's sort of more kooky. She kind of, she has illnesses that she struggles with. She's certainly the one also that we see. She's the one in nearly all of the artistic photographs. And so it makes sense in some ways that she would be credited. But also, if you go back and trace sort of the history of their rediscovery, the person who really rediscovers them is the French philosopher François Le Perlier, who writes the first substantive biography. But the biography that he writes is a biography of Claude Cahun. He talks about Moore in there, but he really, the title of the book is, you know, the focus of the book is Cahoon. And I think part of the reason for that, in addition to the fact that she's the one in the images, is that she's also the one from the family that is a famous intellectual family. You know, her father is an intellectual, as a newspaper editor and author. Her uncle is a famous author. You know, I mean, there's a sort of paper trail to follow. Moore's family was also very prominent in Nantes. They were also very well off, but in many ways they were a more traditionally bourgeois family. You know, her father was the head of the medical school, which is a very prominent position locally, but you know, he was not a famous intellectual. And so I think for a number of reasons, which again, I talk about in the book and talk a little bit more about in this article, I think that erasure has happened over time. And so part of what I'm trying to do in the book, or I came to that as I wrote it, was to help to restore Suzanne's role, because I think Lucy, as from the quotes that I was sharing on my PowerPoint, Lucy acknowledges that very much herself, certainly when it comes to the resistance work, but I think also in terms of the artwork as well.
It's partly because they've been labeled as self-portraits again and again, haven't they, in, you know, sort of exhibition and publication context, because after all, when you see a photograph of a certain person, you would generally be interested to know who took the photograph, you know, unless it's identified as a self-portrait, then you know, that kind of avoids that question. And anyway, it's a complicated, clearly
Right. I think that's a great point.
Yeah. There's a question about should we say their influence on more contemporary figures. We've mentioned David Bowie. I could perhaps answer that myself. I mean, Gillian Wearing, who, as you may know, curated a show and indeed exhibited work alongside, I think I'm right in remembering, Claude Cahun's work at the National Portrait Gallery not so very long ago, is certainly one. But the person who comes to my mind, although the gender bending aspects are not so evident in her work, is of course Cindy Sherman, who is all about masquerade and shifting identities in a way that is quite clearly indebted to Cahoon's work. Would you agree, Jeffrey? I think
absolutely. I think Cindy Sherman is the person that is most where there was the most frequent comparison. I think in part because Sherman's work is very much about identity. It's about representation. It is about gender and how women are presented and represented. But also to problematize that and to think about, you know, to pose questions about that. And so I think that many people who are familiar with Sherman's work sort of see Cahoon as a sort of an ancestor, so to speak, an intellectual ancestor of that, or predecessor. And so I think there are other people who've been inspired by the work. Certainly, Dior did a fashion line a few years ago based on their work. So I think you could probably make a long list, especially in more recent years, of people that they have influenced. In particular, now that they have become more well known, although not perhaps as well known as they could be. So hopefully, our conversation tonight and and other things will help them to continue to grow and for people to recognize their importance.
Absolutely, and there's one last question I'm keeping in reserve precisely on that topic. But Aviva, I don't know whether you want to come in at this point with any comments or questions.
I mean, just to completely agree, but I think it's really interesting because I very much agree with Jeffrey about Cindy Sherman being the natural successor, because I think the very interesting thing about Gillian Wearing, so Gillian Wearing did an exhibition that Monica talked about where she actually restaged the photos. She herself became the person within the Claude Cahun photos, and sometimes she had little variations. She would hang a mask, and it was kind of meant to be highlighting the fact that everything we do is performative. But actually, I mean, this is a little bit challenging, but I think in some ways it was very anti the spirit of Cahoon, because it was acting out what had come before. And the whole thing about Cahoon was inventing new things and challenging and asking new questions. I would say, actually, though, we've talked a lot about the artists they influence, but they've influenced a lot of writers too.
Yeah.
So kind of contemporary writers such as Sarah Waters. There are quite a lot of contemporary queer poets who refer back to Cahoon. So her writing, because we think of her as the auto-portrait, was the word, the self-portrait. Actually, she was a person who was very involved with words. It was Marcel Moore who was the images. So I think we're going to see more and more of that influence creeping into the written word as well.
That tends to be overlooked, doesn't it? Indeed, indeed.
Well, and I think that's a great point, because it is true that really when you look at how they identified themselves as creative people, really Cahoon is a writer, was a writer. She identified herself as a writer. She was, very much in the world of literature and words, and talks about the massive library that her father had in their apartment, and she could read and read extensively from French literature and from all sorts of literature, in part to escape some of the difficulties of her childhood, to escape from her mother, who, as was mentioned earlier, had significant mental illness, to escape from the politics of the day. So really, she was very much the one who was immersed in words and letters, whereas Suzanne was the one who went to art school. Suzanne was the one trained in visual art. That's another reason I find it very interesting and surprising in a way that Cahoon gets the credit for the photography, even though Suzanne was the one who really was the visual artist. Neither of them had any training, as far as I can tell, and everything I've read seems to corroborate this. They didn't have any training in photography per se, and they only ever used one camera their whole lives. It was as far as I can tell, a relatively inexpensive Kodak camera. It was not a professional camera. They never upgraded to something different. They never developed their own film. They didn't own any lighting equipment. They always preferred natural lighting, and so they were clearly multimedia artists. I mean, they were able to cross those boundaries, and even in their resistance work, even if they were writing a note, sometimes there would be an illustration involved, or they would type it in such a way on their typewriter that it would have a visual effect. So they were clearly, crossing those boundaries and blurring those lines all along. That's another reason why, for me, seeing these as collaborators, right? People who are building on each other's skill sets and bouncing ideas off of each other. That's what's so important for me, just in terms of thinking about that relationship. And I cite a work of a scholar in my book, Joshua Wolf-Schenck, who wrote a wonderful book called The Powers of Two. And he talks about the idea of the creative pair as being the real sort of dynamic historically. And he gives examples. I mean, you could think of examples like Lennon and McCartney, right? You can think of lots of examples of creative songwriters or musicians or writers or other people who really, you know, and you see that especially in couples. You know, there are many artistic couples who have been essential to one another, but usually what happens is the wife gets sort of pushed to the side in a heterosexual relationship. And so I think that's kind of similar to what's happening here in many ways. And yet, when you look at the documents and you look at the process that they seem to go through, to me at least, it really seems to be a complete partnership and collaboration.
Absolutely. Well, I think time is drawing on, and before handing back to Rebecca, I'll end with this one question from Gita Kuhn, which I'm sure we all will kind of second. Just a very simple question: how come their extraordinary story hasn't come to light before?
Well, that's a great question, and I've thought a lot about that over the years that I worked on this project, and I think so. A little bit is speculation here on my part, but I think one reason is that I think the images have been so powerful and so interesting that that's really what's drawn people's attention. The images speak to us. They're so provocative. They invite lots of dissection and analysis. And we saw in the video that we showed earlier of Louise Downey at the Jersey Heritage, looking at that photograph of Cahoon dressed as a weightlifter. I've done a little bit with that myself. I talk about it a little bit in the book. There's a lot more that could even be said about that. So there's so much that you could spend unpacking there. So I think that's part of it, is that just the images are so compelling. I think another reason why is that Lucy's writing, and there is some of her writing is published. François Leperlier, the French philosopher who sort of rediscovered them, posthumously published a very large collection of Lucy's writing. And I drew on that certainly for this project. But when you look at it, I mean, she's a surrealist writer. It's very difficult. It's very complex French. And so I think a lot of people have just not tried to do it. I've just said, this is too hard. I don't want to try to read through this. I think the other reason is that the files, the material is scattered. Some of it's in Jersey. There's also another collection of it at Yale University here in the United States. And by pure coincidence, I actually gave a Zoom talk yesterday at Yale, thanks to the courtesy of their library, where I did the research on this side of the Atlantic. So I had to go to Yale. I had to go to Jersey. I went to the National Archives at Kew in the UK. So really pulling all the pieces together, you know, that took a lot of effort. And for whatever reason, I think others had just not done that or pulled all the different threads together. And so it took me 7 years to write this book. It's a labor of love and an intensive project. But I think those are at least a few of the factors that have made it something that has just, for whatever reason, sort of slipped under the radar, hopefully until now. And maybe now people will begin to learn more about that.
And the whole equivocal position of Jersey in wartime history is also, we haven't got time to go into that in depth, but it's also still largely neglected, I think, isn't it? Gita, I think
until recently.
Another question.
I just wanted to add to that simple question. It seems to me that if you come away from the academic, the intellectual part of this story, it is an incredibly dramatic, popular story. I mean, can't you see the movie? I mean, it's got everything. It's got sex, it's got art, it's got forbidden relationships, it's got a war story, resistance. I'm quite astonished that that nobody has got hold of it. Are you willing to collaborate with such an enterprise, Jeffrey?
Well, I direct all film inquiries to my agent, and actually there have been some queries from film people about it. Every once in a while I get emails saying, are the film rights for sale? Are you interested? And so, that's not my world. I'm in the academic world, and so that's why I have an agent who deals with the other side of things.
I think we've gathered that you're in the academic world, Jeffrey. You're quite clear. Thank you very much. It's a fascinating story. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Perhaps I can just add to that, that although, yes, this is a story begging to be turned into a film, they, you know, the whole, well, both their story, but also the story of the Channel Islands during the war have not been entirely neglected. And I'm sure you're all, for example, familiar with the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Society book that was turned into a much better known and successful film. But you might also be interested to know about the Rupert Thompson book that I think Aviva mentioned, which is a fictionalized account of the relationship between the two women and their stories, called Never Anyone But You. But also a book that I came across, I remember quite a few years ago, called Island Madness, which is not about Cahoon and Moore at all, but is about the nature of wartime in the Channel Islands by somebody called Tim Binding, I think, way back in 1998. And a channel, I think it was a TV series, ITV TV series called Island at War, done in 2004. So in other words, you know, there are, yes, you know, there are exceptions that prove the rule there, but it's a rich and unfamiliar and problematic history that repays visiting many times over. Aviva, did you want to add something there?
I wanted to add into that, just to pick up what you said about Jersey and the Channel Islands. I mean, I think what Jeffrey said is absolutely right. I do think there are a couple of other things, such as they didn't have children or family to take on their story. That their possessions after Suzanne died ended up packed up, and it was actually a box of them were discovered in an antique shop, and that's how the photos know. But I also think what I wanted to really pick up on was what you said about the situation in Jersey, and actually I'm going to add Guernsey too, because one of the things I'm finding really interesting, one of my very close friends who's not Jewish was born on Guernsey, and her mum was around at the time Cahoon and Moore were alive, or Lucy Schwab and Suzanne were alive. I never really heard about them or knew about them. During the COVID outbreak, the pandemic, my friend Tracy went back and was with her mum during lockdown in Guernsey. And she called me at that point and she was like, you know, all the questions I've always asked Tracy, which was how much has the war been talked about? How much do you know about Alderney? How much do you know about Cahoon? That she'd always answered no, no, no to. She said, it's amazing going back there this year, suddenly with the excavations on Alderney, with the work the Jersey Heritage Centre have been doing, putting the pictures into the museum there. She said there's suddenly this conversation that's happening in the Channel Islands, and she thinks it's really interesting because a lot of the people in their circles, she thinks, either stayed silent during the war or in some ways actively collaborated to save their skin. So she also said, you know, it's taken this long for the next generation to be able to have the conversation.
Right. I think that's a great point. And I just would add to that, what the reading that I've done about the sort of war memory on the Channel Islands is very connected to what you're saying, is that it was really forgotten, and a lot of other people who like Lucy and Suzanne, even friends of theirs, people that they met in prison who lived through it, as soon as the war was over, many people found that nobody wanted to talk about it, even the resistance. They didn't want to talk about the resistance. They wanted to sort of brush everything under the rug, because Jersey was in a very compromised position. I mean, in a similar way to France. I mean, France was also, you know, directly occupied by the German army in a very compromised position. French war memory is very difficult, and they're still working that out in many ways in France. And I think that's part of what's happening in the islands. And I think Jersey Heritage has done a marvelous job of helping to push the story out. Scholars, Gilly Carr, who's at Cambridge, has done a lot of work on resistance and studying the resistance, studying the war, and a number of others whose work I was able to draw on, but very recent work, not work that goes back many years, but work that's really just been done in the last 10 years or so. And so I think that consciousness and that generational shift and a number of other things are helping to bring that to the fore. And you mentioned Guernsey. I've been invited to speak next year at the Guernsey Literary Festival. So come and see me in Guernsey. Hopefully it will be in person. The goal, hopefully, is that, you know, if everything is back to some version of normal by the summer or late spring, summer of 2022, I'll be able to travel to Guernsey. But they're interested in hearing more about this as well, and have already issued an invitation for me to come, and I'm looking forward to it if circumstances will allow.
Wonderful. Well, I think on that forward-looking, optimistic note, let's draw the evening to a close, and I'll thank you very, very much, Jeffrey and Aviva, as well. And back to Rebecca.
Well, we await Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, the movie, in collaboration with our three wonderful panelists. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, Aviva, and Monica, for this illuminating insight into these two really unique and extraordinary personalities that many of us won't have heard of or won't have heard much about. And I'm sure now that's inspired us to explore their lives further, and definitely to pick up your book, Jeffrey, if we haven't read it already. So just before we finish, I'd like to flag up our next online event, which is our book club with the pioneering journalist Hella Pick. Hella was one of The Guardian's first female foreign correspondents covering the UN, Africa, the civil rights movement in America, and the Cold War. And she'll be speaking about her new book, Invisible Walls, with the broadcaster and journalist Misha Glenny. And that event will be on the 24th of May at 7:30. So that's a change of date from the one that's been advertised. So do join us for Hella Pick on the 24th of May. To register for a place for that, please go to the events section on our website, jewishrenaissance.org.uk. And we look forward to seeing you then. And thank you for joining us tonight.